I want to welcome everybody out there. I find this format not very comfortable because I can see myself and the panelists, but I can't see all of you, and would like to thank you visually and personally for joining us today. As you can tell from the screen, I'm Andrew Del Banco, president of the Teagle Foundation, and I'm really delighted that we're doing this today and grateful to all the participants. Let me say a few very quick words up front before we get started for real. I won't take time here to go over the basics of what we call the Cornerstone Learning for Living initiative, sponsored jointly by the Teagle Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities. It's very well known to many of you who are already participating in it and to others of you who are interested in participating. But let me give you a short version of what I think this is all about. We want to try to put literature back at the center of what's called general education. That is that part of the college experience that students have before they scatter off into the majors that they hope to pursue to achieve this or that professional goal in life. A slightly longer version is that we've made a bet that many, if not most, college students want something that colleges, by and large, are not giving them. And that is a respite from the credentialing, networking, acquiring of marketable skills for this or that job, proving themselves to their parents, employers, and themselves, all of which is important, needless to say. But they also want a chance to reflect on their lives, on how to live well, on what's worth living for, and even that rock bottom question, who am I? The second part of that wager is that we think it feels safer, maybe particularly for young people, to ask, debate, discuss these kinds of questions in a classroom with mentors and peers, and with the help of texts, words written down by other people, novels, poems, plays. In a way, it's easier, I think, to confront these questions when you can at least begin with the expressions offered up by others. And the last premise I'll mention is that we think the best thing teachers can do for students is not to preach or scold or even instruct them, but to show them, to exemplify what it means to be passionate about whatever it is they're teaching. In this case, reading and writing, and in particular today, poetry. So to that end, we are really delighted to kick off what will be a series of workshops during the course of the current academic year with two writer teachers who embody everything that I was just describing above. They're very well known, so I'll spare them and you a lengthy biography. Reginald Dwayne Betts, poet, a lawyer, essayist, nonprofit leader, holds a law degree from Yale University, and I believe is pursuing another degree from Yale Law School, has worked as a public defender in Washington, D.C. and New Haven, is well known for his essays in which he has written in a riveting and courageous way about his own experience as an incarcerated person and his relationship to literature then and since. And most recently, you will have seen his name because he's a recent recipient of the MacArthur Award, for which we congratulate him. Major Jackson, who's a member of our advisory council on the Cornerstone Initiative, is an extremely distinguished poet with 5 books, last I counted, winner of numerous awards, including the Guggenheim, National Endowment for the Arts, has been a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute, and is currently the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Professor of English at Vanderbilt University. And I know from secret sources that he's also a loyal Vermonter who participates willingly and selflessly in supporting the larger community of readers and writers in that state where he lived for a long time. So we're very grateful to have both of you with us, and people are here to hear from you, not from me. Let me just throw out one maybe starter question, and then I might butt in now and again as the conversation goes on. My sense from reading you both is that for both of you, the saving power of reading, if I could put it that way, in particular of poetry, came as something of a surprise. It almost kind of snuck up on you and seized your imagination. I wonder if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about that. I doubt you can fix a particular moment in time when it happened. Maybe you can, but if you could talk a little bit about why you came to this passion and how it entered your life. With maybe, I guess we can go alphabetically. Dwayne, if you don't mind starting us off.
That does not seem democratic at all. I got a better story though. I don't know. I actually don't know major story. Not at least not about how he first got into poetry. I was in prison. Fucking every story that I tell begins with prison, and I think it's something quite American about that, and it's also something that's really frustrating about that. But it's a bit of joy in it, in the sense that somebody slid Dudley Randall's The Black Poets underneath my cell door. And I think if you could tell a story more than 1,000 times, then it matters each time you tell it is one worth telling. And so I was in a hole, and I shouted out, "Somebody send me a book." And they slid me Dudley Randall's The Black Poets, and I'm asking myself, what fool thinks I want to read poetry? Black poets. I remember opening the book up, and it's a survey from the antebellum period to 1960. And it's Sterling Brown, and it's Robert Hayden, and it's Amiri Baraka, and it's Lucille Clifton. And it's rich enough that you could get lost for days. By the time I got to Etheridge Knight and I read him writing these poems about prison, I was like, yo, I'm gonna be a poet. And it was a wrap after that. The shit sounds romantic. You gotta remember, I was in a cell in the summertime that didn't have a screen on the window, but you had to open the window because there was no air conditioning. And I was sleeping on a mattress that was no thicker than my bald fist. And it was a desperate place, And so it sounds romantic, but it was fucking prison. And that's the story.
Reg, Dwayne, you know that that book was also, maybe you don't know, but that book was also equally important to me, and maybe it's a generational thing. My humble introduction to poetry has to do with the fact that I was the child of two teen parents, which meant that I was raised by my grandparents. And my grandmother was a great proselytizer of literacy, of reading. And she collected books from church basement cells, from wherever she could get books, libraries that kind of gave them away. She made sure they were in the house, and they were not on bookshelves like behind me. They were just kind of stacked around the house. And on rainy days, that became my activity. One could say that my neighborhood was its own kind of prison, given the amount of activity and that one could eventually, the trouble that one could get into. So staying in sometimes was the best decision. Anyway, in these stacks, my introduction to poetry was the selected poems of Langston Hughes and a little paperback of Robert Frost, edited by his great admirer, Louis Untermeyer, was a little small paperback with this etching of this old man on front. The interesting thing about those two authors is that one wrote with me in mind and the other did not. And I think that's the nature of literature. By the time I got to college, I was studying with the poet Sonia Sanchez, and she did not assign that book. She signed other books, but I was very hungry for literature. Even though my major was accounting, I was taking as many literature classes as I could, chiefly because of what Andy just kind of earmarked. I wanted something more than business case studies. I wanted something that was going to speak to me and my life, and maybe speak to the lives of people that weren't around me as well. But Dudley Randall's gorgeous paperback, Mari Evans is in there, as you know, Etheridge, Langston, Jean Toomer. It's just a rich panoply of voices that I fear without us advocating for those poets, we may lose them. But it's a generational thing with that book. It was such an important feeder into my imagination and thirst.
You know, the wild shit is, I don't know if it's a similar contemporary book that holds the same place. And you know, and it was interesting. It's like, I mean, I think of I ain't in none of the anthologies. I mean, I don't give a fuck. But I'm just saying, like it's really interesting how he was able to do something, and we all remember those people. And I think about all the anthologies I'm not in, and I'm like, you fucked up. You know, like I mean, like you made a mistake.
Hey, how about after this, man, you get working on that.
But it's funny though, because I think about, like, one of the reasons why that's foundational is because it has both the voices you know and the voices you don't. And even if you think about Every Shed I Ain't Sleep, you know, which was the second joint that I read that really hit me in terms of, like, because Yusef ain't in Black Poets. You know, Yusef is in Every Shed I Ain't Sleep. And what's interesting, and Afar ain't in Black Poets, he in Every Shed I Ain't Sleep. And so what's interesting is I wonder, when you live in a moment, how much, like, what does it mean to be the sort of curator of that moment? Because I feel like, I mean, they all our friends, so I'm not really criticizing nobody, but I'm just saying, when I look at those joints and I be like, I'm absent, or like, I got a stanza. Thank you. You know, thank you. I mean, you know, they gave me a hook. They was like, yeah, Dwayne could get a hook in 400 pages, we could give him a hook. But it's really interesting because I think that for me, you know, I read The Garden Thrives. I mean, these are anthologies I bought because I was trying to meet new poets. It makes me want to edit an anthology now, because it makes me realize that, like, honestly, the way that poets get introduced to readers is going to be through anthologies.
That's right. It's not volumes. That's right. It's not whole volumes.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm an
part
editor.
of what you're talking about, in my mind, is the context by which the anthology serves its moment. And we were, you know, you were in DC, Maryland area. I was in Philly. And these were the Reagan years and the early Bush years. We needed those particular voices to write to us in the future. Randall had already established himself as an editor at Broadside Press, of course, so his ear was already to the ground. Subsequent generations need to hear from us. And that's the work that we are attempting to do. And it takes a curator. Michael Harper and Anthony Walton, in putting together Every Shed I Ain't Asleep, was also doing some of that work of advocating. Here's some voices you need to know that are not up in here. Even the covers, you know, those covers.
Yeah, I mean,
equally important too.
I could legit grab the covers right now. I think I think it's on the other side of my bookshelf. I got Every Shaddai on the other side of the bookshelf that's beside me, and I got the Black Poets in my truck because I use it in my solo show. So I carry it around with me all the time. And there's some great anthologies out right now, like Camille Dungy got the Black Nature anthology. Kevin Young, he did the new
Giant
African American,
Steps.
right?
And the 250.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's interesting though, because it really is. I think about it in the context of what I do for the New York Times Magazine is, and in the past, I mean, it's really the magazine, they ask you to do all of this contemporary work. So you choosing contemporary writers, but in doing that, you really are like in the middle of the moment. And sometimes I try to do a flashback to the past just because try to remind us that we live in a continuum and it's not just yesterday. But nah, man, that's we done asked 10 questions off of the one, because it really does have me thinking that the greatest gift you could give a young reader, and you know what though, I liked Every Shed Eye. So Black Poets made me a poet, but Every Shed Eye made me a good writer, or helped me become a better writer. And part of it is because you could read all of Every Shed Eye, so it's also mastering the length of the book. And so that, like, the Garden Thrives, that shit is like this thick, you know what I mean? It's an impossibility. And even that joint Ethelbert did, it's not as thick as the Garden Thrives, but it's a longer book. So it literally is like as many words in it. And so what happens is, I think in terms of being a curator, Michael Harper, like, you get so much of I, you get so much of Etheridge, you get so much of Komayaka, you get so much of folks that people don't talk about anymore. Who wrote Death is History? This dude is a beast, and we don't even talk about him.
Right.
So could I jump in with a question? Dwayne just said something about becoming a better writer.
Jay Wright.
Yeah.
Yes.
About becoming a better writer. And I'm thinking, I'm imagining this classroom full of students who have no idea what a poem is. No idea what the difference is between a poem and a newspaper article, or a tweet, or a speech, or any other form of writing. How do you talk to young people, potential readers of yourselves, of what it means to make language sharper, more intense, more effective than the verbal universe that they're surrounded in, the tweets and the sound bites and the lies and the euphemisms and so on. Poetry, I mean, that's where we all live now, right? I mean, and poetry aspires to be something different. So how do you face this sort of blank sea of faces in the classroom and say, we're going to read stuff that's different from what you're used to? How do you convey that?
Since I laughed, let me take it first. Because you jumbled like lies with tweets.
Well, that's true.
I think I will say this though. I think that the power of language is that you feel it when it's different. And I do think that, like, students might be immersed in more language than any human beings have ever been immersed in the history of humanity. But I don't think that the power of language has in any way been watered down to the point that students can't feel it when it's different. And so you could it's something about Bad and Bougie. You know what I mean? It's something about it that makes people gravitate towards it. And I think that all music doesn't carry that thing, even all contemporary music. So I think that students can recognize it. They can recognize it when they say something. That's why some of them get listened to more than others. The point is that poetry is a vehicle, and you introduce them to the vehicle, but you're not introducing them to the idea of travel. You're just introducing them to a vehicle that they might not be familiar with. I think, like, far too often, we as educators want to believe that we got this holy grail that is missing from the lives of our students. Nah, we just got another vehicle that we want them to access and love. But sometimes they reject what we offer because of the way we approach it. My fucking tweets is like gold. You know what I mean? I don't put some tweets out there that I was like, the only reason this is not a book is because a book takes more work, but it's it's not even necessarily more effort. It's like more work. And so I would say that I think I would just give the young people more credit. Damn, I said the young people, Major. This is
I think we both sport a spot of gray, so I think we earned it. I'll follow up with to some extent, you know, we as educators also model that particular passion for the possibilities of language to kind of satisfy a certain level of curiosity. In a way, we are matchmakers. We're anthologists. Each semester begins anew the possibility of showing some young person, you know, how to hear it, how to hear beneath all of what you listed, Andy. And that makes poetry a necessity and a demanding necessity. I'm talking about the music of the language, of course, its texture, but also all of its nuances. And each year I teach, it's almost an accretion of the skills to find what is being said underneath what is being said, underneath what is being said. So, of course, that's everything from metaphor to the cadence of a poem. It's technical dimensions, but in a way, it also fine-tunes their ability to critique, reason, argue, and play. That's so much of my work as a poet is about play, and I don't mean that as a certain kind of privileged thing, but also, and more importantly, a survivalist thing.
So listening to you, I got this irresistible appetite to actually hear one of your poems. And Lonnie, I think we are in a position to put up on the screen this beautiful poem that Major wrote called "Let Me Begin Again." Could we put that up on the screen, Major? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but would you be willing to read at least maybe part of it?
I think that's why I'm here.
Okay, great. And talk a little bit about how this poem manifests exactly what you were just talking about.
Sure. I'll read it and then talk. Actually, let me talk about it first. First of all, this is an homage to a very important poet to me. And so kind of what Dwayne is talking about here is that we are brought into this space because we've encountered poets who not just inspired us, but kind of spoke to the inner life of who we are. And one of those poets for me was a poet of the working class, Philip Levine. He has this beautiful poem called "Let Me Begin Again." And often for me, I feel like my poems are in conversation at some level, and then sometimes they riff, you know, it's like playing standards. So this is a kind of a playing standard on his poem, "Let Me Begin Again." Let me begin again as a quiet thought in the shape of a shell, slowly examined by a brown child on a beach at dawn, straining to see their future. Let me begin this time knowing the drumming in my dreams is me inheriting the earth, is morning lighting up the rivers. Let me burn my vanities, old music in the pines, sifters of scotch, a day moon like a signature of night. This time, let me circle the island of my fears only once, then live like a raging waterfall and grow a magnificent mustache. Let me not ever be the bird cage or the serrated blade or the empty season. Dear glacier, dear sea of stars, dear leopards disintegrating at the outer limits of our greed. Soon we will encounter you only in motivational tweets. Reader, I should have married you sooner. This time, let me not sleep like the prophet who believes he's seen infinity. Let me run at breakneck speeds towards sceneries of doubt. I have no more dress rehearsals to attend. Look closer. I am licking my lips. So going back to talking about, it might be helpful to keep that up for a second, Lonnie. So for me, there's a certain level of dynamism that poetry has to enact if it's going to push beyond speech that is in the service of mere communication. I want my poems to sound like they can be played in a jazz club or in a symphony hall. So great emphasis on the music, but the theme underneath. And I think when we teach poems, yes, it's important to get the theme, but we really need to teach students to feel it, and not just feel it in their intellect, but also feel it in their body. Once they do that, then they'll understand that, for example, those three images, the bird cage, the serrated blade, the empty season, all carry certain kinds of symbolism. And that's what I'm talking about, is that a word is not just operating at the level of literalness, but it's also engaging in other kinds of conversations. Bird cages are about caging. That bird cage is meant to also echo Maya Angelou. The serrated blade is obviously a weapon. The empty season is one in which, of course, if our lives are not at a level that contains a certain level of vibrancy, then it might be one of depression. This poem is also tending to a very important discussion about how we're treating the earth and all the species, including humans. So this poem wants to make a cry for a certain kind of awarenesses. This was written in the wake of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. I feel like when these events happen, I feel like my art is called to kind of serve a deeper purpose other than personal expression. And I think it is important that we acknowledge language, at least the language that we use and employ in an artful space, can have a social and or political impact. So I want readers to imagine, not when they see a brown child, I don't want them to imagine fear. I want them to imagine a more sensitive inner awareness of a child that has great possibilities for their future, hence that opening line. I'll stop there. I can over-explain this poem and there'll be no more magic left to it.
I appreciate that. And but oh, Lonnie, if you could, well, no, I got my copy, but if you could put it back up for one more second, because I'm hesitant to let it go. The closing lines are so beautiful, and I just wanted to ask you, Major, if you have any thoughts about how these lines might strike the students that we're trying to serve, that is mostly young people in their late adolescence, early adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
Reader, I should have married you sooner. This time, let me not sleep like the prophet who believes he's seen infinity. Let me run at breakneck speeds towards sceneries of doubt. I have no more dress rehearsals to attend. Look closer, I'm licking my lips. I was really knocked over by those lines. They reminded me of a lot of other poems, but I guess the question I want to ask is, the thrust of them seems to be, what you don't want is to look back at missed opportunities. What you want is to live, as Thoreau puts it, to drive life into a corner and face it in all its wildness. This sense, it must be quite frightening for young people to read these lines and worry about what choices they're making, what opportunities they're missing, what crowd they're running with. So if you have any further thoughts about that, I'd appreciate it. And then
Mhm.
and move on to a poem by Mr. Betts.
Yeah, I guess that direct address to the reader, that apostrophe, that moment of apostrophe, probably has to do with the fact that I know that some of the perception of poetry is that it's self-indulgent and pretentious. If I mean, I think that's a lesser understanding of the work of poetry. Um, I guess in that moment, I'm making space for saying, hey, this is not a self-indulgence. This is a quest. Um, I don't want answers. I want to address the questions that are prominent in our lives together. I like the space that the communal space that a poem can create, a pathway of connection. And I guess to some extent, I'm letting myself be a little bit more intentional with my poetry. A lot of times, I won't say I'm just doodling, but sometimes you have to kind of hype yourself into that space where the poem feels urgent. And I guess that's what it is that this poem is so much about the urgency that was created as a result of last year's tumultuous reckoning with our racial past.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Could talk about it a lot more, but we should move on. Lonnie, if you don't mind, and I hope Dwayne, you don't mind putting up a very different kind of poem, but I think equally powerful in a different way, called "In Alabama" by Reginald Betts. This is a part of a series of poems, if I've got this right, that you call the redacted or redaction poems. And I was drawn to this in connection with what we were talking about earlier, the difference between the language of poetry and all those other forms of language that are out there. As I understand it, this is a legal document presented by the Civil Rights Corps, arguing on behalf of incarcerated persons who are unable to get out even temporarily because they can't afford bail. And what you've done with it is blocked out most of the words and thereby highlighted and called our attention to others. So this is a poem that, well, rather than my talking about it, could you tell us a little bit about what you were doing here and why, at least for this reader, it has such force?
I think one of the things is like, I'm a lawyer, but legal documents tend to obscure, and they tend to be really long. They got a lot of Latin and a lot of statutes, a lot of footnotes. And sometimes what's most important, sadly, I mean, maybe not sadly, it's just a reality, right? Like sometimes what's important isn't the legal question isn't the same as the human question.
Right.
So like the legal question might be, was a statute violated when was the Constitution violated when the police approached you and accosted you and disrespected you in front of your friends and family? And the legal answer may be no, because probable cause, like the famous line is like a ham sandwich. You could indict a ham sandwich for probable cause, which is to say that the floor is so low that essentially you need nothing to get over it, right? And what I wanted to do is say that what matters is not the legal question, but the human question. Is it constitutional to lock people up because they can't pay bail? Well, theoretically, you set bail because of dangerousness, and it's really hard to tell when bail is set because of dangerousness or because you want to lock up people who are poor. And so if you kill somebody, if you rob somebody, say, with a gun, allegedly, and you get a $500,000 bail, I mean, theoretically, the judge could say this is about dangerousness, and they find a way to equate money to dangerousness. But we know in some ways it's about poverty. And so the poem, I'm trying to get away from the legal question and get at the human question, and just concede that the human question is a differently interesting one.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I urge everybody on the Zoom to look at these poems. They're really very haunting, and I mean, disturbing is too weak a word. If I may, on this theme, or at least related to it, a couple of things you've written and now I'm looking at prose works. In your memoir, you speak about your discovery of literature while in prison, and you talk about writers as disparate as Walter Mosley and Arthur Conan Doyle and James Baldwin, and you say something that really jumped out at me. You say, they gave me a world far from mine that still had the feel of my world.
Mm.
Which reminded me of something Melville writes, a sentence like that, and I didn't have the good sense to go look it up. And the confidence.
I'm certain he stole it from me.
Sorry?
I'm certain that he stole it from me.
Yeah, that could be, because he kind of was able to see ahead. It's true. But he says something like, literature is about another world, but it makes you feel like you know that world. And so that really struck me. And I wonder if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about the way in which literature can expand our imagination and get us to places where we sort of feel like we've already been there. I mean, I think that's a challenge for students, because at the outset, they don't want to read about stuff that has nothing to do with them. But maybe they'll discover otherwise. Anyway, I'm babbling.
No, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and one that I would have to think about for a little bit. I don't know what I think about students and what students want to read and don't want to read. I think that I think a lot of it depends on how old the students are. A lot of it depends on how work gets introduced to them. Mm-hmm. And I think most of the time we ask people to read too much material. And so, because like, if you want somebody to enjoy something, I started a book club for 6 to 11-year-olds once. Fucking stupid, dumbest idea ever, right? And only people who volunteered their children to be in my book club was people with 6-year-olds. It's as if they were conspiring to teach me a lesson. I didn't realize that a lot of 6-year-olds actually don't know how to read. You know what I mean? Like, and so like, I got this book club for these 6-year-olds, and I'm like, let's talk about the book. And they're like, nah, yo, let's play tag. like, this is not tenable. They're like, what is tenable? They didn't say, they was like, what is tenable? And I learned the value of a close reading, because we would just read one paragraph out loud. And if we could spend 5 minutes talking about it, I was happy. I think you talk about Melville. I mean, I think the beauty of Melville is that you got these passages that are like super rich and meaningful. And the whole time I was in college, I don't think that the classroom was really a location for that kind of deep exploration. I'm doing sound design for a solo show, a theater piece that I'm putting together. And I was on the phone with my sound designer and my director, and it took us 1 hour and 30 minutes to go through 3 minutes of the show. 1 hour and 30 minutes to go through 3 minutes of the show, and afterwards, I felt like I had just took the LSAT. It was rigorous, it was rich, it was like deeply thoughtful. We believe that students should be able to approach books that we've read. Teachers ain't shit, man. They read the same book every year. They teach the same book every year, right? And then they think that these freshmen that have never read it are supposed to approach that erudition, and their passion for the text on a cold reading. It's like John Coltrane, like, oh yeah, come on, let's do the thing. Oh no, here go the music. And he been playing it for 20 years. It's almost disrespectful. So what I would say is, like, when I said that, the reason why that could be true, it's because I read so many books and was able to immerse myself in the first time I read Paradise Lost, the first time I read Paradise, I had no idea what happened. Mm. The third time I read it, it was a symphony. Mm-hmm. And once you get a moment like that, then you could do a sight reading or something and grab something from the very beginning. But I think what we demand, these kids just went to in high school, they didn't even have to read. They had to imitate.
Mm.
You know, they were trying to perform to get to us. And so I think part of what I would just say is like, when I wrote that, I was literally being better than I am. One, I don't remember writing that sentence, right? And two, I know that that sentence was far more thoughtful than I was as a 25-year-old. And you know, and so I think that we got to find ways to give students the opportunities to be more thoughtful than they are as 19-year-olds and as children, you know.
Mm.
Well, that's fantastic. It almost sounds like I put you up to saying all that because we could use everything you just said could be in an advertisement for what we're trying to do here. Starting with the first thing you said, which is don't ask them to read too much.
Well,
I mean,
yeah,
right? I mean, let them read
Yeah.
slowly. Let them learn what it means to read slowly. And because the words are on the page because they were very carefully chosen as opposed to some other word that might be on the page. And most students don't get that. So Major, you wanted to
yeah,
modify what?
yeah. No, it's a very important dilemma. My students demand that the poems I teach them be relatable, which I think is a really kind of difficult. Almost, it sounds like a tribal cry. Everything has to turn back to me and my world. And we know that their growth is going to be contingent upon them being able to see beyond their particular neighborhoods, their fraternities, sororities. And so what we're doing is we're bringing the literature of the world to them, which sensitizes them, in my mind, sensitizes them to not so much who they are. It will do that. But create a landscape of possibility of existing harmoniously on Earth. The question of quality over quantity. I've always said, I want to teach a poetry class, lit class, just 6 poems in 14 weeks, six poems. And I could give you a history lesson on that poem, a lesson on linguistics, political science, philosophy, and maybe even throw in some architecture and art history. But because we think they should be able to quote passages of the Big Whale book or Flaubert's Madame Bovary and Morrison's Beloved and Ellison's Invisible Man. Just read one book over a semester. And let me just say, my great wealth as a human being has been owed to literature and books that I've encountered. Most of it on my own.
Yeah.
People kept talking about Crime and Punishment. I said, oh, I better read this Crime and Punishment. You want to understand Woody Allen? There you go. See what I mean? I think the sentence that Dwayne wrote goes back to that phrase, the human question. It's not the period or the age. We'll get an understanding of 17th century French society through Racine, but it's how human those folks are, what their foibles are. And that's the world that comes to us. One also wants, in my mind, when I'm writing, I'm trying to write against all sorts of misunderstandings, indoctrinations. I'm trying to create a world in my poems that goes beyond the surface reality of people that look like me and Dwayne Betts. It's not an appeal for our humanity. It's laying it on the page to be dealt with.
It's wonderful to hear you say that. And again, I want to assure the audience there was no collusion here. My sense is there's so much emphasis, and much of it well-grounded and to be understood, so much emphasis on difference. Difference is the theme of so much academic work, intellectual work, historical work. And difference is critically important as a way of understanding the disparate human experience. But my suspicion is that most young people feel when they read, if they're white and they read Ralph Ellison and they read those opening lines in Invisible Man, saying, everyone, again, I'm butchering it with paraphrase, they look through me, beyond me, over me, they see everything except myself. That's not an African-American dilemma, though it has been imposed with particular brutality on Black people in our society, but it's a human dilemma. The students want to be seen. They want to be recognized for who they are. And they all bring complex personal histories into the classroom and into the world of college for 4 years. And literature, I think, can help them see that people who don't look like them are having the same challenges and the same anxieties. That's what I believe literature can do by way of contributing to, what did you say, Major, a more harmonious society or a more mutually understanding society? Am I making any sense at all or not? And feel free to say not.
You're making sense. And I do feel like that question, that debate of identity versus humanity or the human experience has been weaponized to kind of silence the important work, at least in contemporary literature, of acknowledging all the various ways of being human. So when I speak about a more harmonious society, it's contingent upon the fact that there's no idealized way of existing in the world that literature is going to hold up. Hopefully, it inculcates the virtues and values of difference. Like we see each other and not through our particular lens. One of my important poets, and I know this poet is important to Dwayne, is Yusef Kumayaka, and there's something afoot of a bunch of people writing letters expressing their gratitude. But he has a poem that's been important to me called Venus's Flytrap. It's important to me because I want to introduce that precocious, imaginative Black boy who takes umbrage, who takes joy in the outdoors with the little boy in Robert Frost's Birches. I want to introduce that boy to Gwendolyn Brooks's The Life of Lincoln West. I want to introduce. So what I'm saying is that here's 3 poems about the inner life of children, all of whom find some sort of, and The Life of Lincoln West is a brutal poem. I'm just going to say that now, particularly that ending. But all of them have a connection. And it's not just boyhoodness, but it's their interior lives that is fed, at least in the first 2, in the outdoors. And with Lincoln West, we can almost predict the future of that child by the poem's end.
Yeah. Dwayne, if I could, just before we leave this theme, and I guess we're going to wrap it up shortly, I want to say something that might be slightly different from what I said a moment ago. I was reading not long ago your review of this recently published full-length Man Who Lived Underground by Richard Wright, which, as many our participants know, was published as a short story and then only recently as a full-length novel. And you wrote a wonderful review in which you make the following statements. It's a story about a guy who's seized and accused by police of a crime that he has no connection to. The tragedy here is not what ultimately befalls Daniels, but how a single interaction with the police causes him to profoundly question his own identity. That's Betts, not writing that. And then a second sentence that jumped out at me from your review. There is something of a lie in every confession. There's something of a lie in every confession. Now, what I want to say is, you know, those sentences jump out at me, and I think they would jump out at students because they have authority. Those sentences are written not by a student of our penal system, but by somebody who has actually had these experiences. And so
I don't know if that's true.
Okay, tell me that it's not true.
I mean, I don't know what experiences you're suggesting that I had, I guess, first. Like, I mean,
Well,
me and the police are cool. They don't fuck with me. I mean, they pulled guns on me, but that was because they heard that I was pulling guns on other people. It was actually true. So, like, me and the police are cool. And
okay.
And the bit about it's something of a lie in every confession, I mean, I think that's human. So for that second line, I think it's not true for the first. I think it's true for the second, but to the degree that it's true for the second, I think it's mostly because I'm breathing. You know, part of what I do think about is when we introduce students to work, what do they mean by like this connects to their experience? Because like you find that when you introduce them to something that's like really devastating for them, like I'm gonna tell you a perfect example. Fucked me up. I was listening to Under Pressure, and I never heard it before, and I was like,
Bowie?
Oh,
Are you talking Bowie?
And Queen, but I was like,
Yeah.
yo, they sampling Ice Baby. First mistake. Second mistake was I said this out loud and publicly. The people who are older than me immediately shamed me and informed me that the history that I was referring to of music extended further back than my life. I think the history of our experiences extend further back than what we cognizantly understand and can project out in conversation. And so what happens is a book doesn't have to be about, you know, Suitland, Maryland, or Philly, or New York. It doesn't have to be written by Richard Wright. It could be written by Isabel Allende. But what happens is when she really does it, she hits something that reminds me of the emotional texture or experiential texture of my life that I had been like reluctant to confront and acknowledge. So I mean, I think the biggest challenge is we believe that, and biggest challenge to creative writers is that we believe that to write something, we have had to experience it. I tell you, I wrote a poem, and it's like, you know, it was about a dude who goes to see his brother in prison. And it's like, and it's a line, and so the point is, I read this poem, read it a bunch of times, and somebody say to me, after reading, I just gotta hug you, brother. I mean, I hope your brother's doing okay. I was like, oh shit, my brother's like 14. I think he's cool. You know, he's any 14-year-old. And I don't tell the lady this, right? But she thinks that the poem was autobiographical because she thinks that the only way the poet can have voice is if they write through autobiography. But I don't think the poem is autobiographical. And that wasn't my experience. And the only tragedy in this story is that she might have only connected with the poem because I read it. If you would have read it, she'd have been like, oh, Andrew made that up. I don't think Andrew knows. Hey, Andrew hasn't been to prison. Whose brother? And wouldn't have listened to the music or the language, to the lower frequencies. None of that. So in some sense, as a Black man in America, I have to reject the, you know, Elizabeth Alexander wrote in A Black Man Says Sorbet, that certain stories about Black men will always be in vogue. I got to consistently resist those narratives. So when people say things to me like, it's so great that you went to Yale Law School, how do you feel about that? I mean, it's
Mhm,
actually it's outstanding for somebody like you.
mhm,
Motherfucker, it's outstanding for somebody like you. You know, you ain't been to Yale Law School. Your people ain't been to Yale Law School. Don't talk to me like that.
mhm.
And it is a consistent, like, I think almost necessary need um to impose upon a kind of peculiarly, can't even pronounce the word, but you know what I mean. What does it mean to be a problem? That is how we structure too many of our communications with people who we will imagine to be the other. And it's really challenging because if we're trying to do this liberal arts education, if we're trying to believe that books and literature matter, and if we come from it from that first place of what it makes you necessary, it's this kind of elusive difference that you carry, you're already telling me as the student that I can't connect to the well book.
Mm,
Right.
mm,
Right.
I'd be interested. It's so funny though. My kids eighth birthday, right? I was reading the Moby Dick, and then so I faked like Moby, like Ishmael was related to us, and so I wrote a letter, and then I burnt it, and I balled it up, and I put it in an envelope, and I mailed it to my friend at the courthouse, and she came and delivered it to him. And I was like, "Oh shit, it's a letter. Who's it from?" He was like, "I don't know. And I can't really read it. The writing is messed up." I was like, "I'll read it," and it was like, "Call me Ishmael." And my youngest son was like, "Moby Dick again." He was like 5, right? And but what happened is that to make a long story short, because of our engagement with the book, this 8-year-old black boy for months was like, yo, this shit is me. So much so that when I lied and said that Ishmael Reed was a Betts, and that every year on the 9th birthday of a Betts clan member, they get this as a gift, their own
it's beautiful.
copy of our life story. Like for 2 weeks, he was like, yo, this is the shit. I didn't know. And then he turned 10 or 11 or 12, and he was like, I forgot all about it. But
Yeah.
for a moment, it was real. And I think that he didn't believe that I had to experience whaling to believe that the story was true. And I think that's what I hope for all of our students.
That's what you are talking about. I want to go back to Isabel Allende and opening up a space for, I think you said, for to deal with something that you're not dealing with yourself, creates a whole different radical approach to the classroom, and the purpose of literature, not something that is gained as some sort of cultural capital, literary capital, but something that is hopefully going to be transformative in far deeper ways than currying and being able to say Moby Dick, right? I read Moby Dick. And what a gift you're giving to your children in that regard, because we know no one has a monopoly on literature, no one, which is the point I was trying to say earlier. Melville may not have written that book with me in mind, but it's out there in the space for us to receive it for both its aesthetic brilliance, but also what it has to say about the journey. My big pushback, going back to those particular narratives that are thrusted upon us, is that somehow you and myself escaped. Somehow literature and our success allowed a certain kind of freedom. Like all of our stories are neo-narratives.
Yeah.
That's equally frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's real.
Gentlemen, would be insensitive for me to say more than a slightly extended thank you after the wonderful remarks you've just made. I will say that I couldn't have asked for anything better. We got Melville in here. We got the concept that literature has the power to transport readers out of themselves. We got, as Major just put it, that studying literature is not about accruing cultural capital. These are the themes that we believe in, which is why this program exists. And I want to just end by saying a heartfelt thank you to you both for your work and for your participation in this. And since some days it feels like it's hard to find optimistic news stories. I would just say that this program is going great. And we believe that students want what you're talking about. We see hundreds and thousands of students signing up to take classes that are being taught in the spirit that you've just exemplified. And I think it's almost to the surprise of some faculty members and administrators and donors and trustees who don't believe that students have the appetite that we've been talking about today. So I want to thank you both very sincerely for taking the time to be with us.
Can I just say one thing?
Please do.
Hearing you say that reminds me of something. You know, I got this organization called Freedom Reads, which we don't have time to talk about, but one of the things I say, I'm building freedom libraries in prison, and there are 500 book collections that we're installing in prison housing units so that the books will be close to folks. And it's very much a humanities project. But the point I want to emphasize is what I say to people is that, you know, it's the lie that we tell is that people in prison, men, women, and children in prison, don't crave the worlds and desires that get opened by a book. And it's really interesting to hear that parallel, that it's people who suspect the young folks don't desire the same thing. And I love it that college students are proving them wrong and that guys in prison are proving them wrong, and that we got a chance to have this conversation.
Thank you very much for saying that, Dwayne. It means a lot. Thank you both. For those of you who are out there in invisible Zoom land, we're going to let our two poets go now, and Lonnie, my colleague Lonnie Bordaloy-Posich, is going to stay online, and we'll spend a half an hour if you have some practical questions that may be coming up in your efforts to pursue the goals we've been talking about. So thank you both very, very much. And
Thank you, Andy.
I warn you, we may
Always
try to get you back
seeing
into this Zoom world again with us sometime. Thank you very much.